Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Got a serious topic for you today. And I don't know how to introduce it exactly other than to saying that hogs have gone wild. We're drowning in pig manure in this part of the country, folks, and we're polluting our streams and rivers and groundwater, and it's a horrible problem. My wife's been very active on this issue for a number of years. I know she's going to really like this, and I hope that you do too. And I thought a good way to get to this would be to cite a recent article, an op-ed piece written by James Merchant and David Osterberg. Now, James Merchant's a professor emeritus of public health and medicine. He's a founding dean emeritus of the College of Public Health at the University of Iowa. David Osterberg is a professor emeritus of public health and co-founder of the nonpartisan Iowa Policy Project. Now, those two guys a couple of years ago called for a state moratorium on the introduction of new CAFOs in the state of Iowa, and now they're saying so little has been done that we need to do something here nationally, that this has gotten to be such a problem that immediate action needs to be taken. So, Professor Osterberg, come on in here. Welcome to a podcast by George, first of all.
Hello, George.
Yeah, and tell us now, when I was a kid, and I'm getting on a little bit, a guy that there were a lot of farmers that raised hogs, and a big hog producer might have 100 hogs, couple of hundred hogs, something like that. What is a CAFO for people around the world that may not know what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's either a confined or concentrated animal feeding operation, CAFO, C-A-F-O. And they really got started in the 80s and have just gone bigger and bigger. And that's right, George. It used to be, I used to be a state legislator. Actually, I used to chair the Agriculture Committee in the Iowa House. And back then, you would find 60, 70, 80,000 farmers in Iowa had hogs. And now we have 5,000. About. These are rough numbers. It's because of technology, and technology often changes things. But it's also because that technology was able to just run rampant. No one said, that might make you a little more money, but what about your neighbors? No one said that. In Iowa, we have some very, very weak laws protecting neighbors from these very large facilities, which are really factories out in the farm fields.
And they're huge. I mean, we're talking massive on a scale that most people have never seen or can hardly believe. Let me read what you've written here, because this is very interesting. You say that your review of the published research on water quality and public health and the impacts of these CAFOs, and you've concluded that Iowa's past the tipping point for action. Manure leaks and spills result in fish kills, nitrate and ammonia pollution, antibiotic, hormone, and bacterial contamination, algae blooms, impaired waterways, and closed beaches. Now, the people that live around these things, these 5,000 CAFOs that you're talking about, and bear in mind, I know for a fact that the people that own and operate these things don't live there. Nobody could live there, my God. Well, the people that live around these things, they suffer increased childhood asthma and adult asthma, bronchitis, airway obstruction, nasal and eye irritation. Animal agriculture still consumes largely for growth promotion. About 70% of medically important antibiotics, and the practice promotes antibiotic-resistant infections. And the neighbors, go on to say, suffer odor-associated increases in stress, tension, depression, confusion, decreases in measures of quality of life and well-being, and CAFO neighbor property values, if your main concern is finances, which it seems like so many people are caught up in that these days, well, depending on their distance and prevailing wind, it decreases their property value 20 to 40%. So, okay, has anybody tried to do anything about this? Yeah, they introduced bills into the General Assembly here in Iowa and to address the issues, you say, but never even reached a floor vote.
It's going, and
yeah.
Last Friday was the bill that was introduced this year went down. There's a system within the legislature where you have to make progress on pieces of legislation. And if they don't make enough progress on certain dates, they are dead. So the bill is dead for the season. And the same bills were introduced in the past. State Senator David Johnson, past state senator, he's no longer in there, introduced 15 different ways we could do something back in 2018, and every one of his bills were crushed. But you said one thing, George, and that's we have these large CAFOs, 10 to 15,000 of them. There are only 5,000 operators, but some of them have many, many CAFOs. So just for clarification. And the data's been there a while. Back in 2002, when I just had started at the University of Iowa Department of the College of Public Health, Vilsack, our governor at the time, asked the College of Agriculture at Iowa State University, College of Public Health at the University of Iowa, to get together and come up with some recommendations. And we did. But those recommendations, although they made it into the Iowa Code, especially on air emissions from hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, very dangerous products, there was really no rules on this. You couldn't get through rules to actually make any effective choice. Our laws are very, very weak. And I think that's why you'd find 5 veterinarians from Minnesota coming into Iowa to start a CAFO, because our laws are so much weaker than they are in surrounding states. And
well, it's really...
Sorry?
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, the notion is that somehow if we put regulations on, we're going to kill this industry. And all of a sudden we aren't going to produce any hogs, which is poppycock. It's just that we may not get the huge expansions that we've seen. And we really want to stop that incredible expansion because it is not good for everybody in the state.
And just anecdotally, it's really a classic example of this hogs gone wild phenomenon and the effectiveness of marketing, which is like borderline propaganda. I mean, we don't call these pigs, we don't call them swine, we call it pork. They're producing pork. I was at a forum recently where a nutritionist was speaking and referred to pork as a white meat. I mean, again, that's a marketing thing from the Pork Producers Council. It's amazing how Americans have bought into this. And of course, they're absolutely fanatic about bacon, which is the pork belly. It's just basically inedible fat that's seasoned and I mean, my God, we put bacon in everything from chocolate balls to ice cream, and it's created this huge demand for hogs, and there's big business and a lot of money being made in this. And what we're talking about, Professor, is the ill effects that it has on Iowa and Iowans. But just like everything, we're all interconnected. We're all related, and this has an extremely detrimental effect immediately for people that are just downstream a little bit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I can. And our paper that Jim and I did is 2 years old now. We haven't updated that paper. And again, he is a real expert on most of these issues. You especially find effects of asthma, childhood asthma especially. And you have other respiratory diseases that come about from being just too close, a neighbor too close to these facilities. And not just the facilities, realize, because you have to get rid of that manure and you apply it to ground. And that then can be very much closer to somebody living in the country. But there are these kinds of medical conditions. There are also some other things that Jim talked about in this paper. Influenza. You find that, as we're seeing now with the coronavirus, there are some certain zoonotic diseases come from an animal, then go to a human, or often come from one animal to a different animal, change, and then come to a human. And we find the chances for those kinds of outbreaks are very, very big when you have lots and lots of these facilities in your state. And also the other issue is antibiotic resistance. The World Health Organization has, for several years now, been saying we have a potential very large problem because of the overuse of antibiotics. And it's what, George, what you and I do, and we get sick and we are pretty sure it's cold, but it might be the flu. And we kind of demand that our physician give us some antibiotics, even though they may not do that much good. And then oftentimes don't go through the entire course, which we've just made those bacteria tougher. They've made them resistant to some of those antibiotics. And because 80%, and you said 70 to 80% of all antibiotics in America are used in animal agriculture, this overuse, and especially when you give prophylactic doses to animals that are confined in very, very small areas, you can get those antibiotic resistant bacteria going out into the environment. And that may mean that the antibiotic you thought was going to help with this outbreak may not. You've made the critters just too tough.
And the confinement facilities themselves are science fiction horrific. I mean, just to get a visual on these hogs in confinement in these huge facilities and what that's like from a morality standpoint. And I'm not a geography expert. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking, okay, so I know that most of Iowa is tiled. I mean, particularly western Iowa, but we've got these tiles under all the fields. These tiles all run into creeks. These creeks all run into rivers. These rivers all run into the Mississippi or the Missouri, depending on what part of the state that you're in, and this all goes downstream. And so what we're doing here in Iowa is poisoning people south of us, and it's particularly harmful to the Gulf of Mexico, correct?
It is, but I wouldn't use the term poisoning quite.
Okay.
What happens is you're over enriching the environment. I mean, corn really loves nitrogen. You're not going to grow corn without nitrogen fertilizer or manure. But when you have more than the plant can take, that's when it gets into rivers through the tile lines often. But when it gets to the Gulf of Mexico, what it does is stimulate the growth of certain organisms. So all these algae are just happily growing. But then when they die to their natural course, when the water gets a little cooler, then they suck all the oxygen out of the system. So it isn't a poison, it's over enrichment that in the natural course of things leads to a diminution of oxygen. And if you're a fish, you swim away, you're not going to catch fish in that area. But if you're a little crustacean, this is where we used to get lots of shrimp. Shrimp will die because there's no oxygen. So It's quite a poison. That's what you're saying is right. We have a giant dead zone, but it's caused by the lack of oxygen.
Interesting. Thanks for the clarification. There's some math in your article that is really startling. I wanted to cite this. It says, largely because of 23 million hogs, Iowa now has a fecal equivalent population. Now think of our little state here that we have in Iowa. Well, the fecal equivalent population is 168 million people. Now that's from someone at the University of Iowa, Chris Jones, identified that. And it's, again, this over-application of manure too often on frozen ground, isn't that illegal to put it on frozen ground?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
But the regulations are such that you often give some kind of dispensation. I mean, if a lagoon is full and it's going to overflow, then maybe it's better to apply it someplace rather than have that happen. And again, our regulations there are not very strong. The state of Ohio, with the backing of their Farm Bureau, by the way, passed a law in 2015, which really curtailed the amount of application on either frozen ground or saturated ground, just when there's too much rainfall, because the city of Toledo, Ohio, lost its water system for about a week because of animal agriculture. Now, we've even had that happen here in the state of Iowa. Greenfield, Iowa, in 2018 lost its water supply for, again, about a week because they're a surface water system. You're protected more, as you are in my town of Mount Vernon, where you have deep wells 350 feet down where we get our water. Less chance of the kind of contamination that went on in Greenfield or in Ohio. but in general, our regulations are just not strong enough. And so this is because you've taken away any local control. The legislators were damn determined that even though they talk a good game about local government being the closest to the people, they have taken away all kinds of possibilities. 4 counties in Iowa passed a minimum wage, which was higher than the state minimum wage. And they were just struck down by the Iowa legislature saying, you can't do that. They've said that since 1995 for CAFOs. No real control at the local level. And so this is what happened. The way I try to explain it, George, is this. Here you have a farm that's been there for 100 years, lots of those in Iowa. The person knows his neighbors a long time. This is the kind of place where somebody has a heart attack in harvest season, all of our neighbors bring in their combines and take care of his crop. I mean, you see that kind of stuff among the farming community. If this guy's kid needs to get into farming, and it's very hard to do because you can't get the land, and puts up a CAFO right next to the home farm and talks to everybody around, if the county supervisors looked at that, they'd say, yeah, we'll approve it. If it's 5 veterinarians from Minnesota coming into a county they don't have anything to do with, putting up just smaller facilities so they can be very close to neighbors, they'd never allow those. So local control would really take care of a lot of what we see happening. But what we're calling for is until you can get to that kind of a situation, which I believe Iowans all would accept, you need to put a moratorium on any expansion for right now. And the reason for our article coming out now, 2 years after the big paper we did, is that several other organizations have now jumped in. There's something called the American Public Health Association, and all public health kind of folks belong to it. Their board has come out to say, we want a moratorium nationwide on CAFOs, period. And there's even a survey that was done by Johns Hopkins University inside Iowa that found 63% of Iowa voters agree with that.
Yeah, I saw that. I mean, it's another one of these instances where you've got the majority, you've got the people on your side, but I'm always reminded of that cornball line from Star Trek, but it goes all the way it goes back to the Bible, I think, about the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. Well, that's not the case here. The needs of the few because of financial interests, and I think because of the donor class and because of their connections with lobbyists and that type of thing, they're controlling this issue. They've been able to run with the flag thus far, and things need to turn around. My question for you here in closing is, and you talk about a tipping point, it would be easy to think, okay, if the legislature can get something done here, we'll just stop doing this, or we'll reduce the number of the CAFOs and we'll be all right. Are we in danger of doing permanent harm, maybe to groundwater or something that's irreversible, maybe to the rivers and to the Gulf and places like that? Are we at a point of no return?
Well, we're not doing much to clean up the Gulf. And in fact, states around us are doing a much better job. And that's a Chris Jones data that you talked about before. No, things, how soon it would, how soon we could repair that dead zone. And the goal is only to take it from the size of New Jersey down to the size of, say, Delaware. That's the goal. We're going to have a dead zone for a very long time. I would worry more about antibiotic resistance. That is a very big problem out there. You never know about influenza. And so there are those are the big things you're talking about, George. But right now we're looking at neighbors. And neighbors do have to suffer. And there's no question about the loss and the value of your land. If somebody, you've been there 50 years, somebody comes in and plops one of these new things down next to you, the value of your land falls. And you can even get a lower assessment because that's so very good data on that, by the way. Some of it from Iowa State University. No question about this. The response of the legislature, Iowa legislature in 2017, was it make it harder for you as a neighbor to bring an action against one of these CAFOs.
Wow.
That was their response.
Well, let's hope we can help move the ball forward a little bit to create some awareness with podcasts and independent journalism and media and conversations with people like this great man. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. We'll come back to this. The next development, I hope, is a good one. I hope this national moratorium gets some legs. I hope things get done nationally and certainly here. And the worst violator, the worst problem is right here in the home state, right here in Iowa. We've got the biggest problem, huh?
Right.
Yep. All right, that's great. We've been talking to David Osterberg, Professor Emeritus of Public Health, and he's the co-founder of the Nonpartisan Iowa Policy Project. I'll put a link to that and also to this outstanding article and encourage everybody to read this at length, think about it, and take what action you can to help solve this dilemma that's it's harmful to everyone. So that's going to do it. That's all there is, and there ain't no more for today. Check us out on Facebook. Look for us on Spotify. Click that bell on YouTube so that you subscribe and get every one of the podcasts. But for right now, that's going to do it. That's another podcast by George.